Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm DJ Hopkins. I'm a professor at San Diego State University, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the second virtual lecture in our three-part series, Digital Shakespeares, co-hosted by the San Diego State Center for the Study of Media and Performance and SDSU's Digital Humanities Initiative. We're going to start with a land acknowledgement. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy. My colleague, Dr. Pam Lack, will be posting in the chat a link that you can use to find out something about the history and heritage of the land that you're on as you join this Zoom meeting. My thanks to Dr. Lack of the Digital Humanities Center and the SDSU Library for hosting this Zoom event, and to Professor Jessica Pressman, co-director of the Digital Humanities Initiative, and Professor Danny Bedeau, director of the Center for the Study of Media and Performance. The first Digital Shakespeare's lecture was held last fall, and the series will continue in the fall of 2021, maybe face-to-face. Stay tuned. But today, so close to the day on which we traditionally celebrate Shakespeare's birthday, our guests will be talking about digital theater decolonizing Shakespeare in South African schools. Dr. Gina Bloom is a professor of English at UC Davis, where she is affiliated with the PhD programs in education and performance studies. Her research interests include early modern English literature, especially Shakespeare and drama, gender and feminist theory, theater history and performance, sound studies, digital arts and digital humanities, and education. Her recent acclaimed book, Gaming the Stage, Playable Media and the Rise of the English Commercial Theater, is published by University of Michigan Press. Bloom's digital projects include essays on Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream for the Folger Shakespeare Library's iPad app, and a collaborative project with students and faculty in the UC Davis ModLab to produce and study a Shakespeare video game, Play the Knave. I am very pleased to welcome Gina Bloom.
Thank you. So I just wanted to thank DJ for inviting me to speak to you as part of the Digital Shakespeare series. And this is hosted by the Digital Humanities Center at San Diego State University and co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of Media and Performance. So thanks to those centers for supporting this talk. And thank you all also for being here and celebrating Shakespeare's birthday with us. And I would like to start with a land acknowledgement as well to thank the, recognize that I'm delivering this talk in Davis, California, on land that has for thousands of years been the home of the Patun people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patun tribes: the Cachel-Dihi Band of Winton Indians of the Calusa Indian community, the Quetzal-Dihi Winton Nation, and the Yoka-Dihi Winton Nation. The Patun people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries, and I am honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. And finally, I wanted to be the one to introduce Lauren Bates, who is my collaborator on this project. I am, that's being discussed today, Bates, and I'll just give you some information here on the slide. Lauren Bates founded Educations, which is an educational theater company in Cape Town that, among other things, brings Shakespeare performance to South African schools. So I was lucky enough to meet Lauren Bates when I spent my sabbatical last year in South Africa, returning to the country where I was born, but haven't visited in decades. And the city of Cape Town is very much in my thoughts today as people there are coping this week after a devastating fire that I'm sure many of you heard about. So I'm particularly glad that Lauren Bates could be here with us despite all this upheaval that has impacted her and many she knows and loves directly. So we're thinking about you, Cape Town. A little bit more about Lauren Bates. She received an MA in Shakespeare and Creativity with distinction from the Shakespeare Institute at Stratford-upon-Avon in 2018, having also completed an MA in English from Wits University in Johannesburg. What makes Bates particularly valuable as a collaborator for this project, and we're going to talk a lot about this today, is that she is first and foremost a teacher. She received a postgraduate certificate in education from the University of Cape Town and has taught at various secondary schools in Cape Town for many years, including 8 years at Vista Nova, where she currently teaches, and that's a high school for students with special educational needs. So I'm going to be delivering the talk today because technically all the Zoom things makes it very difficult. But this paper is a joint production, and at the end of the talk, there will be time for Q&A, and I urge you to ask questions of both of us. There'll be many questions that I can't answer, and that Lauren will be able to answer. So, digital theater, decolonizing Shakespeare in South African schools. Shakespeare scholar Natasha Distiller raises a number of important questions for scholars in academia about Shakespeare's place in South African education. And she points to a chasm. She says, on the one hand, we have university scholars who are wrestling with Shakespeare in Shakespeare's post-colonial and post-apartheid legacy by producing complex political, historical, and theoretical work. On the other hand, there is the teaching of Shakespeare in secondary schools, where teachers usually lack the training and the critical resources to engage students in Shakespearean drama, let alone to decolonize Shakespeare. And Distiller asks this set of questions. He says, what role, if any, should Shakespeare be assured in post-apartheid South Africa? In the context of a struggling and under-resourced education system, whose Shakespeare has the right to claim this role? If teachers are underqualified to teach the university's Shakespeare, how important is it that we insist that they address this situation? So she's really talking to scholars here. What does it mean for the cultural work done in our universities? South African school teachers work in increasingly deteriorating conditions, with little support in the area of teacher training, amongst other areas. And she goes on to observe that one of the primary ways that Shakespeare scholars working at universities have tried to influence how Shakespeare is taught in secondary schools is by developing teaching editions of the plays like these. These were particularly marketed to South African schools. And Distiller argues that these editions have largely failed to accomplish their aim of correcting entrenched inequalities in the education system. The problem here is that academics are largely out of touch with the real world teaching practices in secondary schools. And so they really struggle to translate their decolonizing projects. There is an obvious solution, but as Distiller points out, it's difficult to enact this solution. So she says to teach otherwise than the way enabled by these editions discussed here would take a sustained engagement between the National Education Department, trainers of teachers, and tertiary Shakespeare scholars. However well-intentioned any of these institutions might be, very few of us have the time to talk to each other or do what we do differently. To truly decolonize Shakespeare, right, this is what needs to happen. You need these kinds of practitioner researcher partnerships between university-based scholars of Shakespeare and secondary school teachers. These kinds of partnerships between practitioners and researchers are quite common, increasingly common in theater and performance studies in a different field. And there's in fact an entire methodology dedicated to creating and shaping these kinds of relationships. And it's called practice as research. So I'm going to be talking a lot about it here, so otherwise known as PAR. So in this talk today, Lauren Bates and I discuss how we apply the PAR methodology to Shakespeare's secondary education. In research on Shakespeare performance, PAR, practice as research, has been a boon for theaters and for academics who work with them. Though, as Stephen Purcell, a scholar, points out, there are problems with the ways many PAR collaborations structure the relationship between academics and theater practitioners. And these are problems that we are obviously trying to avoid when we apply PAR to Shakespeare education. I'm going to talk about some different models that he lays out for how practice as research can work. And he's talking about it as how it operates at the Globe Theatre in London, where there's a lot of these kinds of partnerships. So one of the models of collaboration that he talks about is where the academic is the expert, the first one here, and the practitioner is the craftsperson. So when applying this to the realm of secondary education, we could see this as the university scholar is the expert and the teacher is the craftsperson who translates the scholar's research and knowledge into practice in the classroom. Now, one limitation of this model, Purcell notes, is that the practitioner, who is in our case the teacher, ends up being undervalued as a thinker, right? The teacher is simply seen as translating the scholar's research. And to see those kinds of limitations at work, we need only recall Distiller's critique of those teaching editions of Shakespeare, right? Where the collaboration between the academic and the secondary school teacher looks a lot like this first model. Purcell's second model, the witness and the source model here, centers a bit more on practitioners as the site of knowledge. So in this case, in a case of a secondary school collaboration, we would be seeing the teacher as the expert and the source of knowledge, right? Who really knows what's going on in the classroom. And the scholar's research involves observing what the teacher does and trying to learn from it. So this model essentially is an inverse of the first one, right? But like the first model, it still understands the relationship between academic and teacher as one way. So there's a very hard boundary between them. But there is a third way, what Purcell calls the co-investigators model. And let me just read to you just quickly a brief way he describes this co-investigator model. In this model, the academic and the practitioner are equally expert in different forms of knowledge, and they bring them together to explore questions of shared value to both parties, to which neither the academic nor the teacher, right, should imagine they already know the answers. Evidence of this more productive and enticing model of co-investigators is hard to come by in academic collaborations with secondary school English classrooms. But Lauren Bates and I want to argue that it is the key to decolonizing Shakespeare in South Africa. As is true in co-investigator projects in theater and performance, where you can see some of this happening. In Shakespeare education, this model works best if the emphasis is not a finished product created by either one of the collaborators, but an open-ended project around which both parties can experiment and play. So we're going to be discussing how our collaborative project, which we call Blood Will Have Blood, pursues that objective in an effort to transform how and why Shakespeare is taught in South African schools. So Blood Will Have Blood is a set of lesson plans for high schools, along with a collection of writing, listening, and oral competency assignments that we co-created, Bates and I, for use in South African high schools. And we're planning to roll this out in the coming school year. The concept of play is central to these lessons. The curriculum applies the possibilities offered by the digital theater game Play the Knave, and I'm going to talk more about it later, applies Play the Knave to the Shakespeare dramas most often taught in South African high schools, and offers students an opportunity to playfully embody moments in the dramas. At the same time, we fit this playfulness within the framework required by the country's English home language curriculum. So for most South African high school educators, Shakespeare is something of a teaching paradox. So, and a paradox that really explains the difficulties of decolonization efforts. So on the one hand, a survey of South African teachers found that 95% of them believe Shakespeare's plays are essential to the English home language curriculum in South Africa. On the other hand, high school educators find Shakespeare's plays to be much harder to teach than some of the other texts in that curriculum. And we can talk more in the Q&A about why that is. It's true here, but it's particularly true there, and there are all sorts of language barriers as well. In any case, as a consequence of all of this, teachers are more likely to fall back on traditional topics and approaches, including rehearsed ideas about Shakespeare's universality, this idea of Shakespeare as a universal. So rather than arguing for Shakespeare's removal from the curriculum, where he appears to be, for better or for worse, firmly lodged. He's not going anywhere, Shakespeare. He's going to be in that curriculum. So if he's going to be there, then we believe Shakespeare's plays can do much more within that curriculum, provided teachers have the tools to decolonize Shakespeare in their own classrooms. And provided that students have the space and the incentive to play with the plays and speak back to them in their own voices and from their own cultural perspectives and histories. We focus our lessons on the plays teachers are most frequently required to assign, which are up on the screen: Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Hamlet, and Othello. And these turn out to be ideal plays for the kind of social justice pedagogy that motivates our work. One reason for this is that plays dramatize the problem of violence. And as such, they can engage youth directly with an issue of critical importance in South Africa today. So some of you may know that over the past several decades, South Africa has been working to address social injustices in a post-apartheid era. But the country has been plagued by violence, domestic, racial, gang-related, self-inflicted, political, accidental, the list goes on. Blood Will Have Blood, our project, what we do is we select 2 moments from each play that explicitly dramatize these forms of violence. And then we provide teachers with a comprehensive set of resources for students in class analysis and then post-class reflection on how violence functions in Shakespeare and what that violence means in the context of South Africa's history and present. And central to these lessons is playful and creative experimentation with Shakespeare's text, which is facilitated by digitally mediated performance, or what I'm calling here digital theater. Scholars have argued convincingly for the usefulness of performance for decolonizing Shakespeare in South Africa, and they've already begun to show how digital theater resources can make performance more widely accessible to classrooms. And Christopher Thurman is doing really great work on this in South Africa at Wits. But in the English home language classroom, the digital resources that dominate are film and video productions of the plays, or scenes from the plays, and scenes from those productions. By contrast, our project emphasizes students' physical engagement in performance work, or I should say in performance play. So we maintain that shifting away from film and from video productions can help to undo the hierarchical pedagogy so often associated with colonial education. And this is true of Shakespeare education in South Africa, and it's a clear case in point of the problems with this hierarchical pedagogy in colonial education. In our curriculum, students are not only receivers and consumers of performance work that's produced by others, whether that's professionals or amateurs, but they are creators. And by turning students into the primary creative performers of Shakespeare, we are attempting to alter the power dynamics of the classroom. We want to rethink who has the authority to produce and interpret the plays. And it's important to note that the goal of performance in our lessons is not for students to make polished works for public consumption, but rather in the true spirit of PAR, of practice as research, we want them to be using embodied performance to explore, understand, and make claims about those dramatic texts. So PAR, practice as research, and the reason I'm talking a lot about it today, is that it is not only central to how we, Lauren Bates and I, work with each other, it's also and with teachers in South Africa, but it's also crucial to the way performance functions in the classrooms where these lessons that we're using, that we developed are being used. In this curriculum, students do not learn in order to perform plays, but they play with performance in order to learn. So the point is not to make a performance. The point is to use performance to learn something about the plays. This is what I like to call playful pedagogy. And it's a staple actually for many teachers of Shakespeare in the US and in the UK. And in fact, it's central to a lot of the education initiatives of major Shakespeare theaters like the Royal Shakespeare Company in the Globe in England and the American Shakespeare Center here in the US. But most South African teachers, like most teachers in the US, lack the training in and often the confidence to use these kinds of methods on this kind of playful pedagogy. And that's where the digital tool Play the Knave can step in. So each of our lessons begins by inviting students to analyze closely a scene of violence in the assigned play through engagement with Play the Knave. And I'm going to show you around this video game in a moment, but essentially it's a flexible mixed reality theater video game that I developed with faculty and students at the UC Davis ModLab. And I wanted to just put up here the people who are behind this game. So I'm the project director, but it would not exist without all of these people. The development team is listed here, and I know Colin Milburn and I think Nick Toothman might be in the audience today. A shout out to them. These are also the many students that have been involved here at UC Davis in helping to make the game and bring it to schools in the US and really have made it all possible. So I'm going to just quickly play you. I'm going to momentarily switch my screen to show you a quick video of what play looks like, and then I'll take you through the platform and talk a little bit more about how we use it. So here's a little video of some of my students playing a scene from Henry IV, Part 1, using Play the Knave. And let me just pull that up.
And stiff under the foes of vaunting enemies. I prithee, lend me thy sword.
Oh, how? I prithee give me leave to breathe a while. Sir Gregory never did such deeds in arms as I have done this day. I have made Percy. I have made him sure.
And he is indeed living to kill me. I prithee, lend me thy sword.
Nay, before God, how? If Percy be alive, thou gettest not my sword, but take my pistol, if thou wilt.
Give me it. What? Is it in the case?
Aye, how? 'Tis hot, 'tis hot. There's that will sack a city.
What? Is it a time to just...
And I'll just go back to my slides here, just take a moment. And I'm just going to advance to where we just were, if you give me just a second. So that gives you just a sense of what play looks like. As you could see from this, the Knave's platform allows users to stage dramatic scenes karaoke style, and they're using their own bodies to animate their digital avatars on screen. So that's what you're seeing here. Any movement the avatar makes is a response to the player's movement. And also the voices of the characters on screen are produced by the players themselves. So the way this works is that there's that little Kinect camera at the bottom of your screen that you can see. I can't point at it, but that camera captures the body movements essentially of the actors and their voices, and then maps the movements onto the avatar. So the key is that the game's players perform physically and virtually at the same time. Our software automatically records the avatars and the voices of the players and saves the video to the gaming computer. So players are actually creating a short animated video as they perform. But I want to underscore that this video is not the end, right? This is not the point of the exercise. And in fact, you may have noticed that the animated film that's being produced is not all that satisfying aesthetically as a film, because this Kinect camera we're using, which comes from the Xbox system, gaming system, it's a very cheap motion capture camera system. And it's worlds apart from the motion capture performance technology that's used in film animation today. If you've watched Lord of the Rings, any of those kinds of films that use mocap. So very different from that, very different from what's used by professional theater companies like the Royal Shakespeare Company when they do motion capture and performance. So the point here is not to create great motion capture, but instead to engage students in this process of embodied playful discovery that is meant to provoke class discussion. And in our curriculum, the aim is to provoke discussion about violence and its relationship to gender and racial identity and to the various power structures in Shakespeare's plays. So we can use Play the Knave to cue these conversations because the gaming platform is very flexible. And I wanted to just give you an overview of the different features and how we use them in our lessons. So here you can see the opening menu for the game and the different options. So at the bottom, you'll see options to warm up, where players can just feel what it's like to use an avatar and respond to commands, things to do with your body on screen. You can also do free play. So there's no script, essentially just your avatars show up on screen and you can do whatever you want there and play around with them. And in addition to that, you can choose a script. So we have an option to perform theater games. So these are, if anybody's taken any theater improv classes, these are those kinds of exercises, but with an avatar. So it gives you a chance to learn to use your body, but also to learn to use your digital body in the form of the avatar. Of course, there's the option to perform a scene from Shakespeare. So the scene from Shakespeare, we have hundreds of scripts that many of the students you saw on the slide helped me create. They're scenes from Shakespeare's most often performed plays. And then finally, we have the option to perform your own script. And this is what we use most in our lessons, Lauren Bates and I. So here you can use, my colleagues and I at UC Davis created a web-based online tool where anyone can create a script to upload into the game. So you create the karaoke script and the timing, and it shows up right on the top of the screen as you saw. So for our project, Bates and I created scripts of the scenes that we wanted students to study and how we wanted to set those up. I wanted to mention one other option that's here that's built onto a performance in progress. My colleague Nicholas Toothman and I developed this feature this past year in response to the pandemic. And the idea was to allow groups of players to create a digital scene together without being in the same room. So the first player records their character, their avatar, they save their scene onto the computer, and then they leave the room and disinfect and all that stuff. And then the next player comes in and uploads that scene and layers on their character. And you can get up to 4 players. So we're still beta testing this feature, but we've already found it to be very useful, Bates and I, for our curriculum. So just as an example, in our lesson plan for Hamlet, one of our lesson plans, we explore Hamlet's confrontation with Gertrude, his mother, which leads to Polonius's murder, for those who know the play. So to prompt a conversation about how Hamlet's rash violence might signify differently depending on whether Gertrude is supportive of her son or condemning of her son when he enters the room. We have a student perform Hamlet's avatar alongside 2 different versions of Gertrude's character. So her avatar has been pre-recorded as condemning or as supportive of Hamlet. And so essentially she functions as what we call in gaming an NPC, a non-playing character. So in one version, Gertrude collaborates with Polonius agreeably, and she rebukes Hamlet harshly for his behavior. And in the second version, Gertrude expresses annoyance with Polonius and concern for Hamlet's well-being. And so students come to think more deeply about Hamlet's culpability for the murder of Polonius and how that is actually partly determined by how Gertrude's character is presented. In addition to the choice of script, players design their scene. Among other things, they choose a theater stage. And we have 3D models here of historical theaters from the Elizabethan period and also contemporary stages, such as the one my head's sitting in here, which is the Stratford Festival stage in Canada. And these are just bare stages that the players can choose where they want to perform. Players can also select a background audio audio track, so they can use mood music or atmospheric sounds like a storm or a battle. Bates and I use this option in some of our lessons for Blood Will Have Blood to help students learn about mood and tone. And most teachers know these are very difficult concepts to teach. So we give students the power to shape a scene's mood by staging it with these different audio tracks. Now, the feature of the game that is particularly critical to our lessons is the choice of avatar. So Play the Knave offers dozens of avatars, and I'm going to give you just a few screenshots of them, but we have a lot. And our aim here was to offer players a diverse cast in terms of historical periodization. So you can choose Elizabethan dress, or you can choose ancient Greek and Roman costumes, but you can also choose modern dress. And here we really tried to have diversity in terms of gender and race and age and even species. So we've got robots and aliens as an option as well. And this ability for teachers and for students to easily switch out avatars for different Shakespeare roles is critical for using the game in the classroom. That's definitely one thing you cannot do with film and video, right? Film and video, the cast is set. But with the game, the cast is not set. You decide who's going to embody those roles on screen and in the classroom. So in one of our lessons for Othello, we have students perform Othello's murder of Desdemona 4 different ways. And each time we change out the race and the gender of the avatars that are playing those characters. And it allows the students to think about the intersection of race and gender in cultural and historical understandings of domestic violence, among other things. This sort of playful and embodied experimentation with the text has multiple advantages over the traditional teaching methods that have led to so much discomfort with Shakespeare's place in South Africa's education system. Much of this discomfort stems from the way Shakespeare was weaponized by the white nationalist government in South Africa for the latter half of the 20th century. The apartheid government used Shakespeare to police morality and enforce conformity to conservative social norms. And they even went so far as to assign particular Shakespeare plays to schools for white students and other plays to schools for Black and colored students. And just for American audiences, that term colored, which we don't use in this country, but in South Africa, it's the official non-pejorative term widely used for people of mixed race, Khoisan, and Middle South and Southeast Asian descent, just in case you hear us use that here today. Apartheid's explicitly racist pedagogy is a thing of the past, but it's not so distant of a past. And the stakes of authoritarian uses of Shakespeare in the classroom are as high as they have ever been. We feel that for teachers to counteract most effectively authoritarian uses of Shakespeare, their classrooms have to explicitly stage debates about the meanings of the plays. Those debates need to be explicit. So screening different video and film versions of scenes can certainly stimulate debate, of course, but there is nothing quite like having students enact these debates with their own bodies and voices. It gives students a degree of control over their education that has historically been denied to them. What is more, physical engagement with a game offers students a visceral entry point into difficult subject matters like domestic violence. And at the same time, it protects them, the game, right? Because it's only a game. And then the platform's glitchy avatars, which you saw in that clip I showed you, inevitably lead to laughter, you know, when some guy's neck falls off, and it's funny. And the effect is that Shakespeare gets knocked off of his pedestal, his venerable pedestal, and students are invited to look past and through Shakespeare toward the important issues that the plays raise. So while we want to challenge and transform the way Shakespeare is taught in schools, we also recognize that most teachers don't have the space or the time to be revolutionaries, especially in South Africa's overcrowded and very under-resourced secondary school system. So our lessons work within the constraints of the system and of the educators who teach in it. And our main tool for doing so is a series of tasks. These are reading, writing, and speaking assignments and listening assignments that accompany each lesson and connect the violence in Shakespeare's plays to issues in South African history and current affairs. They are presented in an eye-catching manner, and Lauren Bates is the brilliant artist, visual artist behind these. She's a marvel at creating them. Everyone is its own work of art. And the tasks give students a deeper understanding of their own country while simultaneously assisting them with relating to and unpacking some of the issues addressed in the plays. So for example, when we teach Othello, the class looks at the scene when Iago pressures Cassio to drink. And this leads Cassio to become belligerent and violent, and everything goes haywire from there. So after exploring the scene via Play the Knave, the students complete a listening task that looks at the violent outcomes of drunk driving in South Africa during the COVID pandemic. And what happened was that the government had an alcohol ban during lockdown, but then they lifted the alcohol ban and they saw a serious increase in car accidents due to drunk driving. So alcoholism is a huge problem in South Africa. So this task sheds light on students' own context, where alcohol abuse often leads to injury and death. And it also deepens their grasp of the harm that Iago inflicts on Cassio when he urges Cassio to drink. So what we're doing here is juxtaposing students' understanding of the world of the play with their own world, and thereby empowering students to see the outcomes of various choices they make every day and how shifting those choices could shift the current narrative. So some of our tasks also encourage reflection on the role digital culture plays in perpetuating violence. And here again, we're really using the digital theater component of the lessons to get them to process these ideas. So for instance, we have a task on cyberbullying that follows the lesson on Hamlet that I mentioned earlier, right? Remember that one I talked about where Hamlet, students perform Hamlet's role against the recorded Gertrude avatar. So during that lesson, the student playing Hamlet, he physically assaults the Gertrude non-playing character. So students could see viscerally firsthand how much easier it is to harm someone when you're acting via a digital avatar, right? Where the real person is hidden behind a digital facade. They don't see another person there, they just see the avatar. And so our lesson is making strategic use of Play the Knave's mixed reality interface to explore digitally mediated violence. And the task that you see here that follows reinforces those concepts and asks students to connect their experience of the game to their experience of cyberbullying. And you can see that the task is leveraging Shakespeare to introduce topics obviously relevant to students' lives. At the same time, the task cues deeper study of Hamlet's violence. So like cyberbullies, Hamlet earlier in the play refrains from violence when he sees Claudius in real life. He doesn't harm him, but then Hamlet doesn't hesitate to stab the person he believes to be Claudius when he thinks you can't see the person, he's hidden behind a curtain. So we're really interested in getting him to see those connections and connecting to their experience of cyberbullying. So in addition to engaging students in contemplating the violence they experience in their lives today, our tasks also connect Shakespeare's plays to the history of violence in South Africa, and especially the violence of apartheid. After exploring through Play the Knave, the scene in Macbeth in which Macduff, for those of you who know that play, Macduff hears the news of his children's murders. So after we work with that scene in class, students have an option to, if teachers give it to them, to complete an essay assignment that connects this scene to the 1976 Soweto uprising. So the task that you're seeing here shows students a famous picture of Hector Peterson, who, along with hundreds of other school children, was killed by the apartheid police during a peaceful protest in '76. Students are asked then to write about why the image of butchered children in Soweto, as in Shakespeare's Macbeth, how that galvanizes resistance against unjust governments, helping to topple them. And so students engage with this watershed historical event in their own history in tandem with the image of a robust, weeping Macduff motivated to fight for justice by the grief for his dead children. And we think that this parallel inflects both South African history and Shakespeare's play with sharper clarity, because students come to understand how and why pathos compels political activism in their history and politics today, but also in Shakespeare. So in all these tasks, students are really required to enter into an engagement with broader societal issues depicted in the Shakespeare plays and to apply them either to their own personal lives, South African history, or to the current communities in which they find themselves. Now, it's important to note that these tasks not only make Shakespeare relevant to the lives of students, but also to the practical needs of teachers. And I want to shift there now to thinking about the context of teaching in South Africa and the curriculum there. So like the public schools in the United States, the government schools in South Africa exercise significant oversight over teachers, both through assessments and through a fairly tightly structured set of requirements. The South African English Home Language curriculum, where Shakespeare is taught, so in this curriculum for the final 3 years of high school, it's divided into 4 main sections that you see here: language, literature, creative and transactional writing, and oral work. And each of these sections is assessed through an exam in the middle and end of the year, and with a standardized national exam taking place at the end of the final year. And for Americans, it's really hard to understand how critical this exam is. It pretty much makes or breaks a student's life, whether they pass it. And the passing rates are by no means guaranteed. In some places, it could be 30% passing rate. So it's a really important national exam. Now, these continual assessment tasks, like the ones that I was showing you before that we use, these tasks are expected to be completed throughout the year to add to that final result. And the tasks count for 25% and the exams count for 75%. But because the teacher can help students with some of the tasks through the process of draft writing for written and oral work and retaking of tests, the tasks really are intended to boost exam marks and help students pass. So they're very important. And the tasks include short tests of language and literature content, essays and transactional writing, reading, listening, and speaking assignments, those kinds of things. And all those tasks are gathered into portfolios, and then a sample of those are moderated by subject advisors and other teachers to ensure some kind of national standard. So this is what students are doing in high school in South Africa. So Shakespeare tends to be confined to the literature strand, that second strand of the curriculum. And Shakespeare tends to be tested through contextual questions and through literature essays in both the exams and in the tasks. Our project, Blood Will Have Blood, expands the scope of the Shakespeare texts into the other 3 branches of the curriculum. So what we're trying to do here is maximize the value that Shakespeare can add. So when I say I'm expanding Shakespeare's importance in the South African school system and in the curriculum, for some of you out here, this might strike you as very problematic, and especially those of you who believe that the best way to decolonize Shakespeare is to take Shakespeare out of the curriculum in South Africa and replace the plays with the work of Indigenous African authors, for instance. This strategy has been discussed at length by South African scholars. Among them is Lawrence Wright, who lays out some of the risks and the challenges of adopting what he calls a radical version of African cultural nationalism in education. I'm not going to debate here, and Bates and I, and what we're doing here is not debating whether or not Shakespeare should or should not be in there. Regardless of what you think about why Shakespeare remains in the curriculum, the fact remains that the plays persist. They are entrenched in that curriculum, and yet they are strangely peripheral, right? Confined to that one area. And the consequence is, and this is the really important upshot, the consequence is that teachers make the plays seem relevant to South African students by appealing to the idea of Shakespeare's universality. And that tends only to reinforce the apartheid era ideologies that brought Shakespeare into the curriculum and perpetuated where he was used to do such atrocious things. So if Shakespeare is to remain in the curriculum, and this seems likely, teachers need a way to use the plays so that they don't stagnate into relics of colonial education whose purpose is to teach universal values, right? And here we want to echo Christopher Thurman, who writes that Shakespeare should be the means and not the end. Shakespeare is the means. The point is not to get Shakespeare, but the point is to use Shakespeare toward other purposes in South Africa. South African theater practitioners and scholars have actively taken up this mantle. Theater practitioners have developed a rich body of work that resituates and re-envisions Shakespeare, and scholars have explored the decolonizing impact of this performance work, drawing out some of its historical, political, and cultural significance. And on this slide, I've just put a couple of key publications, a wonderful book by Sandra Young called Shakespeare in the Global South, Martin Orkin's Local Shakespeares, and then Shakespeare in South Africa, which is a journal in South Africa that is really a fantastic resource for anyone who wants to learn more about how Shakespeare is being adapted and appropriated by South African theater makers. Practice as research has been at the center of many of those decolonizing projects in Shakespeare theater. But practice as research, or PAR, has not been used in the same ways or to the same degree in the field of English literature education. And perhaps this is not surprising. So PAR is a recognized method in the field of theater and performance studies, and major Shakespeare institutions, theatrical and scholarly institutions, offer many opportunities for theater artists and scholars to meet and exchange ideas. By contrast, secondary school teachers remain largely peripheral in scholarly Shakespeare organizations, and this is true in the US and in South Africa, it's true everywhere. And by the same token, Shakespeare scholars tend to be peripheral to secondary school education departments and also to teacher training programs at universities. When these worlds meet, usually it's theater practitioner researchers who make the connections, for instance, as education artists who come to visit schools and offer workshops and that sort of thing. And here I want to recall Stephen Purcell's PAR model of the expert and the craftsperson, where traditionally trained Shakespeare scholars offer secondary schools expertise, even while they lack an understanding of the on-the-ground problems that secondary teachers face. So let me conclude by just saying a couple of things here. If university-based scholars want to decolonize Shakespeare in schools, they need secondary school teachers as their equal partners. This is particularly important given the degree to which universities are and have always been colonial structures. And I'm reminded here of the words of Ayanda Kali-Thiri, who is an academic theater practitioner in South Africa. And she writes about staging a Shakespeare appropriation of The Tempest in 2015 during the #FeesMustFall protests, when students were demanding transformation to the education system. And she asks, what does it mean for an academic to engage in a PAR project when just beyond the walls of the university theater where she was working, police were firing rubber bullets and tear gas at protesters? And she warns against university-based scholars, and this quote from her, taking for granted the physical danger and pain of those for whom decolonization was more than an academic project. And her larger point really rings true even in less visibly violent school contexts. So academics can theorize until the end of time about how Shakespeare ought to be taught in South Africa. But ultimately, those theories have to be taken up in schools where physical danger and the other violences of inequality are a regular feature of daily life. Secondary school teachers carry an extraordinary burden in their efforts to teach Shakespeare in these conditions. In South Africa, as in the US and the UK, teachers are frustrated by an education system that privileges the test over the content, the end point over the process of learning. But most teachers don't have the time, the training, and they especially don't have the resources to be activists in upending that entire system. What they can use today and what they need now are material resources that invigorate student learning while still conforming to the system that, however insufficient and problematic it might be, it is the system in which they live and work. Digital resources can be an important part of the solution, provided they are not presented as yet another authoritative source of Shakespeare knowledge for students and teachers to consume. And that's really much of what's behind what we're doing here. So decolonization and transformation, we would argue they have to be built from the ground up, with academics working alongside and in true partnership with secondary school teachers and with students themselves as the driving forces of change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. So folks, I am going to kick off a Q&A time with Gina. And Gina, do you want to invite Lauren to join you as well?
Please, please, please.
Hi, Lauren.
Hi.
Hi, welcome. So I'm going to get questions started, but my colleague, Dr. Lack, is going to open up chat. So folks, feel free to post some questions and comments in the chat, and I will try to surface those. There's so much that I find so exciting in this presentation. And Gina, you and I both work in many of the same subjects, but our sort of positionality is slightly different. You're based in an English department. I'm based in a theater department. What I think is so exciting about your work is that it presumes that Shakespeare's works are dynamic sources, that they are raw material for theatrical performance and educational experience. I love the way the foundation of the work frames performances and classrooms as site for knowledge and authority related to Shakespeare. I think as we sit here on the eve of Shakespeare's birthday, what we conventionally celebrate as Shakespeare's birthday, I think for many people, for my students, and for many people even in the field of Shakespeare studies, Shakespeare is still perceived as exclusively writing, as book space that's determined by literary disciplinary conceptions of Shakespeare as a cultural touchstone. So the work that you and Lauren are doing is not only disrupting the power dynamics of the classroom, it's disrupting the cultural dynamics around Shakespeare in ways that disrupt the authority and prominence of these texts and give students and others a place in that dynamic. I think that's marvelous.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really nice way to explain it. And I do think that one of the reasons that I've enjoyed Play the Knave as a project is because it insists you laugh at Shakespeare. And we really take Shakespeare way too seriously. And it's why Shakespeare can be abused in a place like South Africa. It's why it can be weaponized, because it is something sort of imposed from above, and there's the literary text. And I think that once you let anybody do Shakespeare, there's a way that Shakespeare, the use of Shakespeare, I think is really important here, that people use their own voices and they use their own bodies, but also that they laugh at it and they don't have to be good at it, right? And I think that's the difference between me using this game in an English classroom and using it in, say, a theater classroom where you're trying to teach people to be actors. So people often say, oh, well, maybe this should be in the theater curriculum. But no, it needs to be in the English curriculum, because that's where people, as you say, need to transform their understanding of the literary text Shakespeare and really understand it as a performed work and not worry about the final outcome of what they're creating.
Maybe we could bring Lauren into this conversation. Lauren, how do your students respond to this? What is their sort of immediate feedback? They're laughing along and learning in the room?
Well, we actually haven't used it in the classroom yet, this side. So we're still building up. We're testing out all the lessons at the moment. Gina is actually running seminars with her students in the US that I'm attending on Fridays, and we're testing out all the lessons. But I have played it with my 2 research assistants who are still very much kids at heart, I'd say. They're actually my past pupils who are now in their 20s. And they really enjoy it. And I think what's fantastic about it is it takes away all self-consciousness. So you don't have to remember the lines because they're up on the screen. So you're not sort of riddled with anxiety about forgetting lines. Also, you're not looking directly at an audience. You're looking at a screen. So again, you're not worried about people staring at you. So it's a very kind of it's sort of an unself-conscious experience. You become immersed in it, and you, as Gina says, you laugh at what's happening on the screen, and it disarms you.
Yeah, and I have used it, we haven't been able to use this yet in South Africa extensively, at least the program that we've created together. But I have used it in the US quite a bit, and some of my students have helped me get it into California schools as well, where we set it up. And actually, Margaret Bowles is a supporter of this project. I think she might be in the audience today. So shout out to her for helping to support this project of bringing the game into California schools. And we've just found that it's a lot of teachers, even if they've used performance with their students, what Lauren is talking about, that the sort of the fact that students are, they're not in an English classroom, they're not performers, and they're nervous to be up there. They don't want to perform Shakespeare, but it's really the best way for them to understand the plays. And so there's nothing like the fact that you're turned away from your peers and looking at a screen to help you sort of like enter into the performance process. And that has been, teachers have found to be really helpful in English classrooms.
Well, I have to imagine that, well, as I look at your students play the Knave, it seems to me that, you know, you've already acknowledged that what's happening on the screen, little video that's being made, is not really the deliverable. The learning is happening over here, where the students are having fun, and they have this dynamic relationship between their embodied selves and what's happening on the screen. But what's happening in the classroom really is that's where the learning is happening. That's where the learning outcomes really are, not what's the quality of the film that's being made.
Exactly. And we do sometimes use those films. I mean, you can have them as a record. And if you're teaching visual literacy, for instance, they can go back and sort of see it, but they always notice that things are not getting translated, that we're in the room. And I think that's important for them to kind of get that media literacy.
All right. Well, we're getting some questions in the chat. Shelley, or can I ask you to vocalize the question that you posted here?
Sure, I'm happy to. I really want to amplify and thank you for your talk today. Just this week I was teaching Shakespeare in a class, and I said, we have California Shakespeare Festival, we have Utah Shakespeare Festival, Colorado, Oregon, and the old globe here in San Diego. And it's like, do we need this many, basically resources going to one person, just to sort of beg the question in their mind, while at the same time I'm teaching this, right? So the combination. So I really appreciate your recognizing that this curriculum, this author is here to stay with us for a while at least. And that, finding ways to use his works that are more relevant in all ways to our students. I think that's just wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And I think the answer is yes to my question, but I just would love it if you might be able to talk with it a little bit more, and recognizing that you haven't yet had an opportunity to use it in the classroom directly. I'm wondering if the idea that you put out there of playing with the plays and speaking back to the plays allows for them to write an alternate ending to a scene or something like that. I'm assuming yes, but I'm just curious what you envision for that. Thank you so much.
So we actually do. We have one of our exercises is all about bystanders. So we look at bystanders in a scene of violence, and we look at Benvolio in Romeo and Juliet, where he's watching the sword fight between Tybalt and Romeo. And then we look at Lady Capulet, where she's watching the violence between her husband threatening her daughter, basically. And it's about the students write speeches for these two characters, and those speeches then get inserted into the game. And it's what happens if they make these speeches, what then can shift about the outcome of the scene. And I mean, that can be translated into so many other scenes as well, that idea of writing something for a character to say that will turn the scene into a different, less violent outcome. So that is definitely a possibility. Yeah.
And we actually have just used that recently with some of my students were testing out these lesson plans in one of my classes, and it's great. We actually have somebody without even, you can write your script and then upload it, but that would take a day and some, work to do. But what we just do is we just have the screen go blank, and then one of the students from a group who's written what they would want that character to say that character doesn't say, they read the what they've written, and somebody else acts out the avatar's movements. And it was great. We just did it recently, and it was really wonderful.
So here's another question.
That's awesome.
Oh, thank you, Shelley. Here's a question from Ellen. Ellen, do you want to, let me see if I can find Ellen here. Do you want to ask your question, Ellen?
Sure. Hi, Professor. Are there scenes where the entire play is available to play scene by scene? So like in my high school English classes, we would study the entire play at once, like the entirety of Romeo and Juliet. So like, could different students each have a turn to play a scene through the whole play?
I mean, you absolutely could. The one limitation, at least if you want them all to be bodies on the stage, avatars, is we can currently only do 4 characters in a scene because the Kinect camera only takes 4 characters. So you'd have to edit pretty wildly to make it happen. Technically, you could stage the whole play. I do think that having chosen scenes, and I work with my interns here at UC Davis to figure out which scenes would be most playable. And in my experience, there are certain scenes that work better. Like a lot of entrances and exits are difficult for the camera to work on. So I'm not sure it would be the most effective thing to do, but I also have to say, Ellen, that I think it's really important to be able to choose scenes and deeply study a few scenes rather than try to feel like you have coverage. So I'll say to students, read the whole play. Definitely read the whole play. But now we're going to look at the play through this one scene that we're going to investigate in detail and really get to know that scene. And inevitably, it opens up questions about the rest of the play, right? So if you're thinking about bystanders in Romeo and Juliet, why is Benvolio a bystander? We have to understand how his character functions in the whole play before you can see why he doesn't speak up at that moment when he could, right? It's a great idea though. So maybe you can become an English teacher and try it. Let us know. Technically, it's possible.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Ellen. So I have a fairly pragmatic question then. How are the modules delivered to potential players of Play the Knave? Do you get like the Romeo and Juliet plugin, or the Macbeth plugin, or do you have like scenes from each? And how would, for example, Lauren's students upload their new script if they're going to scramble something or write their own adaptation?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that. Let me take you back to this options that I was showing you on the screen here. So the performance from Shakespeare is where we actually have pre-scripted the scenes, and that's what I worked on with students here from UC Davis in creating those scenes. So there what happens is you choose, I didn't show this screenshots here, but tragedy, comedy, or history. Then you choose your play. Then you say, do you want a scene for 1 to 4 characters? And we actually have the plot summaries for each scene in there. So you can kind of decide what you want to do. If you want to perform your own script, we have just an online, any web site, anybody who has web access can go onto this tool and just type in their lines and choose their character. You save your scene, you give it a name, and then you can just upload it. It'll say perform your own script. And when you push this, it will look in your desktop for your, in your computer, your file system to find that. You click on it and then you choose all of your assets of theater and avatar and all that sort of thing.
Oh, cool. And how widely, forgive me for not knowing this, I probably should be a super fan and have like a Play the Knave t-shirt on, but how widely available is the game?
So it is currently available on our website, which is and I'll put this up here for people to, if you want to look it up, playthenave.org, you can go to download, you can just download it. The challenge is you have to have the Kinect camera, and which is actually, they stopped making the Kinect, so it's free and cheap. And one of the things that I kind of love about this is that we're using old technology. So with the help of Margaret Bowles, we actually bought a bunch of Kinect cameras and little tiny computers so that if people don't have a high-powered enough computer and don't have the Kinect camera, they can just borrow a kit from us. And so if there are any teachers out there that are thinking, I would like to try this, all you need to do is email me. You pay for the shipping, and we may even be able to help with that if you're in an under-resourced school and you need some help with the shipping. So we can send the kit to you. You borrow it for a month or whatever you need and then send it back to us. This does not work internationally, unfortunately. It's just in the US at the moment. But it's actually great. I've had a lot of teachers who reach out to me and use the game like all over the place around the country. I've never met them before, but they've used it, and sometimes they use lesson plans we've developed. And our hope, actually, Lauren and I, the curriculum that we developed, the lesson plans, I'm working with students at UC Davis now to adapt those lesson plans so that they fit the Common Core curriculum here in California, but one that's used elsewhere, so that actually you could also use our lessons, the lessons that Lauren and I developed to teach California and US history and the particular ways violence has worked in this country as well.
Oh, wow. Thank you. My colleague, Danny Bedeau, was texting me in the background about Play the Knave. So I'll definitely put the two of you in touch. A couple of questions here. A question from Margaret Ferguson has to do with what are the sort of resources, including web access, in South African secondary schools?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the great things, so terrible, that's the quick answer to that question. So one of the things that's nice about this platform, although it's, you do need the computer and the Kinect, but it does not run on an internet connection. In fact, because we're trying to not let Microsoft send through their fabulous updates that we all hate and then mess with our software, we've frozen the computers and taken them offline. So when a teacher borrows the kit, they simply bring it into the classroom, and all they need is a projector, which they could also borrow if need be, and a white wall. Most schools have a projector and a screen or a white wall or a TV that they can hook it up to, and that is all they need. So currently I'm working with the Department of Education in the Western Cape. They are going to have a library they have a library for teachers, and the idea is that once Lauren and I get this curriculum all set, we'll be able to basically put a little kit in the library. Teachers can come, check it out, put it up in their classroom, the game, use the curriculum here, then return the kit. So that's the idea, is to have the whole system packaged so that you don't have to worry about what kind of web access they have. They won't need any.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And speaking of lesson plans, Jason asks, are there lesson plans or maybe even content programmed directly into the game that it directly address colonialist ways in which Shakespeare has been
weaponized? Oh, sorry, DJ just felt. I'm hearing a stuttering DJ in your sound, but I got your question here. Oh, I'll let him finish up there. Lauren, do you want to?
We haven't directly explored that. Sorry, give me a second.
Just so you all know, Lauren is actually at a boarding house where she works. So there's lots of students coming and talking.
I had to tell one of the girls to keep quiet.
Go for it. Go for it.
So, okay, I was referring to the lessons that were assigned in South African schools alongside the game. Yes. So we haven't. One of the plays that was taught during apartheid to Black students was Julius Caesar. And it's very interesting. It was actually translated into isiXhosa, which is one of the indigenous languages. And the intention in teaching Julius Caesar was to show people that when you rebel against the power structures, it is a bad thing and you will end up dying. But John Carney, one of the major Black South African actors who has done incredible work over the many, many decades. He did protest theater, he's done Shakespeare, he's done Shakespearean protest theater. He was also in Black Panther. And he speaks about Julius Caesar and how when he read it, he received revolutionary ideas. So this whole the way that Shakespeare was weaponized in South Africa often also turned in on itself. It sort of backfired in that ideas of revolution were actually made more enticing through the Shakespeare texts. And there's a play called the Robben Island Shakespeare, which looks at Shakespeare plays that were read on Robben Island in the 70s by political prisoners, and how those texts became important in terms of resistance, in terms of humanizing their experiences, in terms of literacy, in terms of creating communal engagement. So this play I've actually done with my students at Vista Nova, and it was an incredible learning experience for them as well, because they learned about their own history through doing the play and linking the Shakespeare with historical events. So I think that's a very good point. I think it's something that we can explore in the future, actually unpacking how Shakespeare has been used. Because I also was really struggling because I've always loved Shakespeare and sort of been quite a bardolatrous person in my life. And I've also had to take Shakespeare off the pedestal in a sense. And I had a very profound moment 2 years ago at a conference where I was speaking to a Black Shakespearean performer and academic, and I was trying to understand, why are people so angry about Shakespeare? And he said to me, it's because we had incredible poets writing in our own language, and those poets have been, or it has been said of those poets that they got all their ideas from Shakespeare. In other words, saying that anything good that's come out of African poets is because of Shakespeare, i.e. the West, i.e. white people, you know. And so what really needs to happen is to be reading indigenous poetry and reading Shakespeare, not by saying, look how great Shakespeare influenced them, but by saying, look at these beautiful texts, what can we learn from them together? And I think that is what I envision for the future, that these texts are speaking to one another, and also, that white South African students start to learn the poetry of indigenous writers. I think that is very important. And I think highlighting poetry itself. So taking the Shakespeare text and then getting students to write their own poetry. And then from that, in that way, they're also creating indigenous voices. So one of our tasks is writing a poem, because their voices are indigenous South African voices. So I guess in that way, we're also kind of drawing on that resistance of offering their own voices and seeing their own voices as equal to Shakespeare's voice.
And that really speaks to a question that Sandra Young is asking in the chat, a great question about how we're also building in, thinking about and sort of working with transforming classroom space. And kind of moving beyond a hierarchical way, treating the classroom space in a less hierarchical way. So by having student voices so central, right? That's part of that flipping the classroom to focus on student performers as poets, as performers, all of it, as writers. And I think just to kind of more broadly speak to that question, I think that if you think about how Play the Knave functions in the class, if you think about even just the way spatially it's set up, the teacher is marginalized, literally physically marginalized, because the teacher, all they do is push the buttons to make the game show up on screen. So they're doing the technology, but it's the students who are performing, and the students who are the kind of primary audience and that you hear and that you see. And so I think that's, if that gets at the question you're asking, here that Sandra Young is asking in the chat, I think that is spatially a changing of the hierarchical kind of formation, spatial formation of the classroom. And please speak up if that doesn't kind of get at what you're asking, because it's a great question. And are there others out there who would like to ask questions? I know I've got some students from my Shakespeare adaptation class out there. You're welcome to speak up if you guys have any questions.
I just want to say something about the weighting of marks that are given to Shakespeare. So Shakespeare only counts 7% of the final matric mark. But what lands up happening is that about 60 to 70% of class time is spent on Shakespeare. And so there's this disparity to what you're getting out of it as to what you're putting into it. So that's also why, for me, using Shakespeare to cover other tasks that need to be accomplished is very good use of time and efficient, and you kind of killing 2 or 3 birds with one stone. So that's also part of the rationale behind that.
Yeah, and obviously, if we were to have Shakespeare work in these sorts of ways, there may be room to put in other authors, Indigenous African authors, just to kind of come back to that question, if you can kind of make space for Shakespeare. So Shayna Hall is asking if there are any activities involving performance of Indigenous poetry or plays. So, we don't have them in our curriculum here, but there's no reason why you couldn't. So the creating your own script, that option to create your own script really allows anybody to do that. So you can put in whatever content you would like. So when I presented this game when I was in Cape Town before the pandemic and met with some of the heads of Department of English, the English teachers there, English departments in the Western Cape schools, there were teachers in the room who also were thinking about other authors and how they teach other authors. And there's no reason why they couldn't use the platform to do other kinds of work. So the curriculum that Lauren and I are developing is specific to Shakespeare. There's only so much any of us can do. But we hope that people will adapt the platform. And what you're really asking there is a great question, Shayna, about adaptation of the platform and of the game. So the game can be used for lots of different contexts because it's flexible enough to do that.
Hey, I just wanted to mention I'm back.
No
I'm
worries.
so terribly sorry.
We're okay. We're fine. We know. We're used to it.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect timing, of course. Emma has a question. I'll just jump back in here and get back to my role of moderating here. Emma has a question that I think really goes to the foundational questions I was asking right after your presentation. Have you found that Shakespeare is better understood as a literary written device or as a theater performance?
Yeah, I mean,
that's the answer, right?
This is the question of gold, right? That is, it's the reason students are intimidated by Shakespeare is that they're intimidated by what they see on the page. And I tell my students to just read the plays aloud. Even if you just read the plays aloud, you will understand it. The English is not that different. Yes, it's early modern English. It is different from the English we speak in a lot of ways. And it's poetic, right? Poetry is harder. It takes work to understand. But if you even speaking it out loud, I find students understand it better. And then if they have to, put it in their bodies and move around with it, I just find they understand it better. And the reason a lot of students will say, when you assign me a play, professor, I have to go watch a film video version of it because I can't follow it when I read it. And I understand that temptation, right? There's nothing like it. And the reason why you understand it better is because they're communicating in a multimodal way, right? In that performance, they're using their voices, they're gesturing, you can see things in the face. There's a way that they're gonna, with the language, they pause in different places, so you can understand it. The reason why I don't use a lot of film and video in my own teaching, and this is something that we talked about in this paper, is that I think it fixes the interpretation for students. So they think, oh, well, this is what this scene means because Lawrence Fishburne's Othello, that's how it was done.
Right.
And then that is Othello to them. Lawrence Fishburne is Othello, and they can't think about Othello in any other way. So I prefer to start with the text, go to physicalizing the performance yourself, and then think about interpretations, and then maybe you can take on some of those films. But I think the problem is that those films become yet another authority, right? And even if you, unless you're going to go and screen 50 of them, which nobody has time to do, it's a problem. So that's my, that's my take on that. Lauren, what would you like to say about that for high school students too?
Yeah, I think in the exam, so the exam has a 25-mark question on the plays. There's an essay or a set of contextual questions, and they can pick one of those. And there is one question that deals with the text as drama. So it will ask, if you were a director, how would you direct this scene? Whereas all the other questions are dealing with themes, characters, which isn't separate from drama, but it's more abstract. It's not looking at it as a performed piece or, as a piece of theater. So I think they are led to think about it in more abstract themes, characters, not really structure. They don't talk about sort of the structure of the play, the climax or anything like that. So they're not using theatrical discourse. They are using more literary discourse to deal with it. And sometimes they're given quite fixed answers. These are the themes, memorize them, so they're not necessarily really thinking critically about, and coming up with their own nuances. So it can be quite rote, and students will often just write the plot of the story in their literature essays. They don't really know how to argue. It's the hardest thing to teach, to a literature essay. I found when I was teaching, of all the things I had to teach in English, to teach students to write a literature essay and not just rewrite the story of the play, which is what they would inevitably do, is very, very difficult. And for a teacher who does not have a very strong literary background, and I have a strong literary background, and I struggled. So it's actually very hard to get students to write good literature essays. So I do think having more emphasis on the theatrical aspect of it, having more creativity around it, and also more personal application, getting the students, the best pieces of writing I've got out of students are writing before and after the murder, and then they enter into it emotionally. Whereas with literature essays, they're constantly told to divorce themselves emotionally, and it has to be this purely intellectual object. Is designed to evoke our emotions, and yes, our intellect can also work with our emotions, and we can kind of do those in tandem. But for teenagers, engaging with issues around jealousy or love or betrayal, and allowing their emotions to be expressed and to be channeled through creative writing, I find that to be a lot more productive than just answering contextual questions and literature essay, which is why I think that the scope of Shakespeare needs to be much broader, because it can give and their own a space to grapple with their own emotional turmoil, which is very, very present in their lives.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
I don't know if that answered the question,
Yeah.
but in the exams, it tends to be treated more as a literature.
Yeah.
There's one more question for the chat. I don't know.
And the exams take precedence over everything else. I mean, in the CAPS document, it actually says, encourage the students Therefore, no poetry gets written because the teachers don't have time to do anything that's not assessed. And the teachers are always, especially English teachers, they have 4 times as much work as everybody else. They're always at their wits' end. They have so much marking, and they're just overwhelmed. And doing things creative, getting kids to make posters or perform plays or, write poetry does not happen.
Yeah. Thank you, Lauren. We've got time for one more question. And I think Emma Jordan has a question here that you might consider tackling, Gina. How does the understanding of Shakespeare change depending on if it's a theater class versus an
English class? Yeah, I see that one here. Yeah, so it's a great question. I wanted to quickly speak to Eva McManus's question if she's still there.
About Midsummer Night's Dream and the Soviet Union and that play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me, so the, I think in some ways what Lauren just spoke about speaks to Emma's question about depending whether it's a theater class or an English class. So I don't teach the theater classes. And so actually, DJ, you might be a better person to speak about that experience of teaching to theater students. And even Lauren, what it's like to teach Shakespeare to what you're doing in a class when you're teaching Shakespeare to theater students versus what you're doing in an English class.
I have to say that if a student were taking a class from you and a class from me, I think some foundational premises that, a play by Shakespeare is a thing that exists in multiple media, that is simultaneously a document to be read and raw material to be produced in multiple iterations. I think you and I share that. We're not going to have to arm wrestle over that. And then it's just like, what are the learning outcomes? And since I teach the kind of theater class where there's a lot of reading and writing, I think they're going to be similar.
That's interesting.
In our different classes.
I'm not a typical English teacher, actually, when it comes to Shakespeare too, right? So I think that's true. Even when I'm teaching without performance in the classroom, we're learning about theater history and what the plays look like on stage, and the whole class is about what was it like to be an actor back then, and how does that make its way into the play?
And the way the plays themselves on the page open dynamic opportunities for performing that aren't really on the page.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It actually gets me to, if we're thinking about actors in Shakespeare, gets me to this question that even McManus asked, a great question. Oh wait, Lauren, did you want to speak to that?
No, I just wanted to say, so in South Africa, we have dramatic arts as a subject, and then we have English literature. And Shakespeare is taught in grade 11 and in dramatic arts, second last year. And it's much more looking at like the structures of the theaters, looking at the scenery, the costumes, those kinds of aspects, which are not really brought up in the English class. They might be as a peripheral bit of interest or introduction to Shakespeare, difference between the two. The way that Shakespeare tends to be taught in the English classroom is like a line by line analysis, or going through, making sure the kids understand what each line is saying. So it's very, very text based.
Yeah. So this question about whether we're, and I know we're running low on time, so I was just going to speak to this briefly. It's a good question about whether we were considering, given the way that, for instance, Eva McManus asks about Maurice Daniels' comments on traveling with Peter Brook's play Dream, which is an adaptation of Midsummer Night's Dream, into the Soviet Union, and being really interested in the connection of repression of the lovers to the threat of death that people feel when they don't follow orders in repressive regimes like that. So given that and the context, would we think about adding Midsummer Night's Dream or comedies to what we're doing here? And I want to speak directly to this because it's something that I know is very important to Lauren in particular. So we're currently, the plays that are in the kind of assigned curriculum in South Africa are those 4 tragedies. It is somewhat tragic that tragedy is all that anybody is learning there when they learn their Shakespeare. However, so part of Lauren's project and some of the work we're doing is going to contribute to her PhD at WITS in English and in education, English and education, is to make an argument that As You Like It should be in the curriculum. And I wondered if I could just ask Lauren to talk about what As You Like It does for teaching about violence that these tragedies don't do right for us in the classroom.
So for me, As You Like It is the antidote to all the violence in the other plays, as it deals with violence directly. So you have the scene where Orlando comes into the feast, he's brandishing his sword and he's about to attack and he's hungry. And the way that Duke Senior is just so gentle with him, and he says, no, your gentleness shall force more than your force move us to gentleness. And basically just showing the power of gentleness. And I think in South Africa, we have such a bloody history, but we also have a history of forgiveness and tenderness and gentleness and reconciliation. And that's something, you know, there. And if we lose hold of that, we're really in dire straits. So for me, As You Like It really speaks to reconciliation. You've got Oliver and Orlando and their relationship, these two brothers, and Oliver's, you know, charging into the forest to find Orlando and kill him and sleep. And this lion is about to attack him. And then Orlando sees the lion and he decides, is he going to save his brother or is he not going to save his brother? And in the end, he saves his brother from the lion, gets injured himself. And through that act of kindness and forgiveness and mercy, he actually saves his brother from his evil heart. And his brother literally says, I'm a different person. I'm not that person anymore. And for me, that is so incredibly powerful. And I've seen it with people who've gone through restorative justice programs, for instance, in prisons, where they're given opportunities to actually make amends to those that they've harmed, and how it transforms them, and how kindness and gentleness, I've seen it with students that I've worked with, I've seen it in all sorts of contexts, how kindness and gentleness does have a transformative power. And I think that in societies that have been so fueled by violence, kindness seems like a form of weakness. It seems like something quite dangerous, you know, but I think if we can instill in students that it's actually something far more powerful than violence, then we are going to start to reverse the trauma and the reflex action towards violence. So for me, As You Like It has a very, very powerful resonance. And I've actually done it as a play with my students at Vista Nova. I did it in 2019. We put a production together with their own writing as well. So I took quotes from As You Like It, and then they wrote their own poems, and they performed their poems. And then we also did some of the songs from As You Like It woven together. I can actually, Gina, I can send you the video if you want to send it out to everybody.
Yeah, I love to see it.
You were there. Yes, it's when Gina and I had just met. She came to watch my play. And it was such a powerful experience. And it was just around the same time we'd had a terrible murder that took place. One of the, actually it was the beginning of 2020 that we did that show. It was just before lockdown. Yes. So it was last year. There'd been a horrific murder that took place in South Africa. You know, they're horrible murders all the time, but this one sort of stood out quite symbolically. It was a young girl who got killed, raped and killed in a post office in quite a sort of upmarket part of town. So that also grabbed people's attention. And it really galvanized a huge reaction against violence against women in general. But violence, in fact, there's more violence between men than there is against women, but obviously the violence between men spills over into violence towards women and children. So we have to look at the broader issue of violence if we're going to stop the violence against women. You know, we've got to stop the violence between men and the violent urges and the violent trauma that it's actually all stems from trauma of hundreds of years of a country that has been created on the foundations of violence. So if we're going to reverse all of that, we need to start with the children. You know, we need to start with them, with young people, and getting them to think these things through and getting them to take on the mantle of change and of transformation in a very real and personal way.
Lauren, thank you very much. I think that is exactly the point on which we want to end today, because it seems to be the very mission of the project that you're both talking about today. Everyone, please join me in thanking Gina Bloom and Lauren Bates for joining us today and sharing their work with us.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks, DJ. And if anybody has, if anybody would like to reach out to us and ask us further questions, hopefully you had our information. Feel free to email us or follow us in social media channels, which neither of us is really great about, but keep an eye out.
We certainly will. Thank you both so much. This really has been wonderful. Grateful for your time today.
Everybody.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us.